Greetings, and always, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for giving me another hour of your day and another day of your time. Thank you all for joining us on the most important and most powerful platform for truth, bar none, on God's green earth. Without further ado, I'd like to bring in our esteemed guest from Istanbul, Turkey, Tarik Amar. I think it's Amar. I'll bring him in, and I'll let you talk to the people and give them some insight of who you are.
Thank you very much, Rashid, and thank you very much for your very kind invitation too. So just to introduce myself very quickly, by profession, I'm a historian, but I have also turned myself into a political and geopolitical commentator, especially over recent years, really driven by events and by what is happening in this world, which I see with great anxiety, I think, like many other people, and with great worry. I've been trained in various places, mostly in English language places. I originally am from Germany. That explains the accent, I think. And my field in history has to do with Russia, Ukraine, Eastern Europe, 20th century history. That's, I think, very rough sketch of who I am.
Yeah. Well, Tarik, since your field is Russia and that area, let's go straight into what is going on with NATO, Ukraine, and Russia, and why do you think that the United States seems as though she has a grudge against Russia?
I think what we are seeing right now is something very dramatic. I think we are on the verge of a defeat by Russia, inflicted. This defeat is going to be inflicted on both Ukraine and the West that has supported Ukraine. Right? And I want to be very clear here. For Ukraine, this has not been a proxy war because Ukraine is fighting for itself. But at the same time, the Western powers, which have supported Ukraine, have also used Ukraine, as I think they have used it in a terrible way. And in that perspective, which is a very important one, this is a proxy war. And in that sense, what we are going to see, I think, quite soon, I think it's beginning, is a defeat of the West in a proxy war by Russia. And the proxy war is now still taking place in and over Ukraine. Now, why has this happened? I think it has happened for two major reasons, right? If I had to boil it down to two things. One is that Russia, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, of which it was the dominant part, right? The Soviet Union wasn't just Russia, but it was also very much Russia, right? Mm-hmm. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia underwent a period of great weakness, military weakness, political weakness, economic weakness, ideological weakness, psychological weakness, you name it, right? And the trough of this weakness was really the 1990s. Since then, since roughly the early 2000s, Russia has been recovering, and Russia has been reasserting itself. And Russia has been returning to what, if you look at it historically, is a much more normal situation, right? If you look back over the last 300 years, basically, to about 1700, right? There's a reason why I choose this year, but it's not so important. If you look back over the last 300 years, more or less, the default status of Russia in the international system is that of a great power. It's not always a superpower. It's not always in a Cold War just with one other power. Sometimes it's in the club with 4 or 5 other powers, but usually it's in the club of the strongest, right? There's neither good nor bad. It's just a geopolitical fact. So in a way, what happened was predictable. If you go by past experience, the very weak Russia of the 90s was very anomalous. It wasn't actually normal. And it was very expectable that Russia would return to what it usually does, great powering, as it were. And that's what we are seeing. Now, the other thing, I said there are two things. The other thing is that when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed, and these two things are not exactly the same at all, but let's say, right, like between the late 80s, early 90s of the last century, the Cold War ends, then the Soviet Union collapses. The United States is last man standing. This is literally what happens here. It's a last man standing situation. And they misinterpret this last man standing in the United States elites, I should say, right? They misinterpret this in very badly. And one way in which they misinterpret it is this is the new normality. From now on, we are going to be the single superpower on the planet. We will have this unipolar moment. And not only will we have a moment, it's going to last forever, right? This is insane. So at some point, these two things have to collide, right? There's an American elite that thinks we're the only top dog left, literally on the planet. This is their thinking, not mine. And you have a Russia that's coming back, right? As is historically almost inevitable. So at some point, there's going to be a crunch moment. And the crunch moment was reached, I think, sometime between 2014 and 2021. And what happens at the very end of 21 is that the Russians make one last offer. They make it in a very firm way, right? It's not a nice offer, but it's a clear offer. And they're basically saying to the West in December 21, look, either we are going to talk now about basically a big new bargain where we readjust our relationships, right, to this new situation that we are strong again and you are no longer alone, the USA. Or something is going to happen. They're not yet saying it's going to be a war, but they're pretty clear. It's going to be something very, very drastic. I mean, every intelligent person could read behind the lines, between the lines. This was a warning that there might be war, right? And the response of the West to this is no. Just no. We're not going to talk to you, at least not in any reasonable way. Of course, they're building a facade and they're saying, oh, we are ready to talk. But they're basically ready to talk about, I don't know, what to paint the furniture or something. They're not ready to talk about the substance. It's very, very clear. So the Russians take this last no, and then in February 2022, they switch to war. And at the beginning, they don't call it war. They still sort of half call it war, but essentially this is what occurred. So Ukraine, to come back to Ukraine, for various reasons that have to do with Ukrainian history, ends up in the situation where it's caught between these two big processes, and it becomes the battleground. Now, the one parallel I can think of in more recent history of a country to which this has happened, and I think with outcomes that will be very different from what's going to happen in Ukraine now, is Korea 1950. Korea 1950 also is basically a small country that gets caught up in this emerging Cold War and turns into this horrible battleground for 3 years, right? And they're still suffering from the results. And to an extent, the parallels aren't perfect at all, but to an extent, something similar happened with Ukraine.
Yeah. Yeah, we're still here. We didn't lose the connection.
I can hear you.
Okay, good. So why, again, I have to go back to this. I know it's like beating the dead drum. Why is it in America's mind? Why is it in NATO's DNA to push up to Russia's borders, to act provocative towards Russia, and then rebrand it as Russian aggressiveness and Russia's moving towards NATO's border, when Russia has not expanded, but it has been NATO over decades expanding up to Russia's border?
I think there are actually two things here in what you're describing. One is has to do with how the elite in Washington thinks. And it's those guys. They matter. Not the people in Brussels, not the people in Berlin, not the people in London, not the people in Paris. They usually follow, right? And in fact, they have become much more submissive recently, right? So the people in Washington matter here, and they're calling the shots. And concerning what is on their mind, I think it's an extremely old phenomenon, which has to do with the fact that the United States has a fundamental geopolitical strategy. And that strategy is not that complicated in the end. The principle is simple. The principle is we will not allow the emergence of a regional hegemon anywhere. And that is an extremely explosive thing to have as a strategy, because there is a big difference here to saying we will not allow a global hegemon. Of course, they wouldn't allow this. That's what they want to be. No, they're going much further, and they've been going much further for 100 years by now, more or less. The strategy is nowhere in the world can there be a state that is strong enough to build a cluster, a sphere of influence around it, and organize a part of the world to withstand us, a regional hegemon. That has to be prevented at all costs. And one way you can read the Cold War, this long effort against the Soviet Union, right, is that they were fighting a regional hegemon. You have to keep in mind that the Soviet Union, they wanted to be the equals of the United States, militarily, economically, and so on, but they never were. The Soviet Union was always weaker than the United States, significantly weaker. There is an exception in the mid-70s, right, when concerning nuclear weapons, they actually have a few more. Everybody has an enormous amount, and the Soviets have even more. It doesn't matter very much because the stockpiles are so large. And when they also begin to sort of reach out into the world and they're trying to build a big navy, but that's like the peak. On the whole, the Soviet Union is actually always a weaker challenger power. And what the United States really is doing during the Cold War, it's fencing the Soviet Union in. That's called containment, right? They literally call it that. They're fencing them in, and they're slowly squeezing them until they actually did die. That's like the sort of the Python strategy, right? They strangled them over decades. The Soviets, in part, were to blame because they could have adopted smarter strategies to deal with this, right? I'm not painting the Soviets here as these harmless little victims. But ultimately, from the United States, this is what they were doing. And when they win the Cold War, they think that we finally achieved this. Never in Eurasia is there going to be another state that, like the Soviets, could even threaten to build a regional hegemony. There is, of course, China, which is another part of the story we might still get to. But this is different. You mentioned two things. You asked me, what are these guys thinking and why are they so, I would say, obstinate, right? But there's another thing, which is why are they expanding NATO? And that is a slightly different question, because you could make a good argument that when you are in, say, the early 1990s, and you are very conservative, right-wing American strategist, and you look at the world, you could pursue this aim of holding everybody down, including the Russians, but you could also decide not to expand NATO. In fact, it would probably have been wiser on their premises not to expand NATO, right? So there are two things happening here, and they're actually not necessarily in sync. If you look at people like your former American ambassador to Moscow under Reagan, Matlock, great guy, wrote wonderful books, great analyst, still around. That guy is not of the left. And he doesn't try to, trip up the United States and its foreign interests. But he, like other people, like George Kennan, and some other conservative critics, he could see that this idea of NATO expansion isn't even good for us, right? So there you have to explain something else. And I think what's happening here is an enormous hubris. They're arrogant. And they're also historically uninformed. They're very, very uncautious. They get careless. They're carried away with their own feeling of victory that they falsely derive from the end of the Cold War. They get very, very careless here. Look at it like this, right? I know I keep talking, but just another angle. In 1992 or 91, I can't quite remember, I think 91, George Bush Sr. gives a speech. I think it's a State of the Union address. I can't quite remember. And he says, by God's grace, we won the Cold War. Right? First of all, that's blasphemy. And I mean it. That is actually blasphemy. Yeah, right? If you're serious about your religion, whatever it is, you don't invoke God for that sort of thing. Right? That's not what he's busy with. But the other thing, it's also factually wrong. Because what actually happened, and he should have been smart enough to see this as a former head of the CIA, what actually happened is the Soviets lost the Cold War. That's true. They lost it. But the United States didn't win it. They won it by default. They won it because the Soviets lost. That's a very different thing. That's not like winning, we did it. And the problem here is not just that it's stupid to say something like that. The problem is when you misunderstand what has just happened in this way, that's when you become arrogant. And out of this arrogance, they completely overestimated their own abilities. Remember the first Gulf War, when one of these neocons actually literally said, you guys who think this is dangerous, and of course they were all right? You are all still living in the reality-based community. And he thought that was a criticism. And he said, we are making reality. That's the degree of hubris, of arrogance that was around. And with some people, it's still around, right? And once you become that arrogant, it's not just a character flaw. You become stupid. You become seriously stupid. And if they hadn't been so stupid, they would have listened to even conservative voices inside their own establishment, like William Burns. Sometime in the 2000s, he did it several times. He writes this famous little note, this message back from the embassy in Moscow, where he's a political officer or ambassador at the time. And he says, if you bring in Ukraine, it's the reddest of red lines, which is basically saying, please don't do that. This is really not a good idea in our own interest. And they disregard everything. You can only explain this, in my view, by the fact that A, they thought they were invincible, and they're not, and B, they thought that Russia would never come back. And both ideas are really childish. They really make no sense. You wonder where these people went to university, frankly. I mean, honestly.
William Burns, who is now, for those of you who may not know, he's the CIA director. He used to be the U.S. ambassador to Russia. And at one point in time, he gave a note saying that if the United States move on Ukraine and try to bring it into NATO, that would be a line or a step too far, and Russia would react militarily. This was long before this military operation or whatever had taken place. So, but I want to go back to something that you said when you were talking about how NATO under the United States kept trying to pressure Russia and hem her in and to surround her. Isn't that the same strategy that she's trying to use now to the reemerging Russia and China? And with an exception, she no longer has unlimited resources. She no longer has an unrivaled military, and she no longer has unrivaled political clout. So this is a recipe for destruction for the American empire due to the fact that China can match her on every level. And now we see that Russia is outproducing and outgunning not just Ukraine, but all of Ukraine's backers. What do you have to say about that?
I think you're right. If I can add something, the strategy concerning Russia is, I think, is now, I might be wrong. Maybe things turn around miraculously, right, for the West. But I think that the strategy concerning Russia is failing right now. It's been failing for a while, actually, but we are now getting to the point where it's becoming catastrophic in the sense, for the West, in the sense that if you look at the latest reports from the war in Ukraine, really from the front lines, it's horrible. And I think it's possible that this war ends with a Russian victory even before Trump becomes president. There are in the West a lot of people who still, in the media and among so-called experts, who still, try to sell you this line that, things aren't great. They have understood that by now. But we somehow will make it through 2024, and then something happens. I don't think they will make it through 2024. I don't think that's the case any longer. I think it's unfortunate. Well, it is likely that Russia is going to win this war either very soon or in the summer. And once that happens, Russia will impose its terms. As you probably remember, shortly after the war began in February 2022, there was a real opportunity. We now know that it was very real, it was very genuine, there was a real opportunity to come to a peace very, very quickly. That was basically there by March, April, right? And that peace, the structure of that peace, we know this too by now, was essentially the Russians saying, okay, you know what? We go back to where we came from, to our starting lines for this invasion, and we call it, that's it, quits, right? And we start over with negotiations and talks and so on. So even the leader of the Ukrainian negotiation delegation in the talks then, first in Belarus, then in Turkey, has by now admitted in an interview in Ukrainian, which I've watched like 3 times, that the deal that was on the table and almost ready was favorable to Ukraine. That was a really good deal. And so we all know what happened next. The West comes in. The point man is the leader of Great Britain, Boris Johnson, a monster and an idiot. I'm sorry, I have to be very clear here. And he basically tells Zelensky and the Ukrainian leadership, don't take the deal, go on with the war, you get a better outcome. This is exactly what happens. The Ukrainians make the enormous mistake of taking the gamble. It's a horrible gamble, and they're now paying for it. And they continue the war. So what is happening now is that when the Russians end this war, they will now end it on their terms. So this package that was on the table in 2022, it's not coming back, and nothing comparable. And how do we know this? Not only because that's sort of the logic of war, we know it from Putin himself, because he's given an interview about 2 weeks ago or so with Kislyak, who's a huge, big media figure, right? So important interview, no doubt. And I've watched it myself, and he says, yeah, we are open to negotiations, but not on the basis of fantasies, but only realities on the ground. And when you look at this interview in context, what he's really saying is we are now winning, and you're not getting this nice deal anymore. You're getting the deal that you get when you've lost the war. That is what he's saying. Yeah, no, it's very clear. So this is happening to Ukraine. So the idea that they could the idea with the proxy war against Russia through Ukraine was to use Ukraine as sort of a theater of war, but also as sort of a device, a weapon almost. They weaponized the country, right? To use it to take Russia down a peg or 2 or 3, to diminish Russia. I mean, remember what they said at the beginning, not just the Americans, like Ursula von der Leyen, Annalena Baerbock, German foreign minister, they all came out. I mean, you read these quotes now, it's insane. In early 22, and they said these things like, we're going to ruin Russia. We're going to ruin Russia. Basically, we won't leave a stone on the other in Russia through our brilliant mix of proxy war, they didn't call it that, and economic warfare. And both has completely failed. James Galbraith wrote on this in 2023, and he's summarized his argument recently in a great interview. And he's shown us, and he's absolutely right, that the sanctions, the economic warfare, this is what this really is. We've done massive economic warfare against Russia. We've used everything we had, and we lost, have backfired. The Russian economy is stronger. The Russian military is stronger. As you already said, the Russian MIC, military industrial complex, stronger. I mean, these are facts by now. We have made Russia stronger and much more independent from the West. So we've lost a lot of leverage in the process. So now we come to the second country you mentioned, right? China. So if these guys in Washington and in Brussels and in Berlin and so on were rational, you would expect them to think, oh my God, the first part of a big global strategy, knock out Russia first, then deal with China on its own, has failed, right? In fact, we are weaker, Russia is stronger, China will not be alone, because we've also driven them closer to each other. We've reinforced the de facto Russian-Chinese alliance. It's de facto an alliance, whatever they call it, right? So if they were smart, at this point they would say, look, we really have to cut our losses. Let's give up on the China part, right? We have to make peace with Russia on very unfavorable conditions for ourselves. Let's not even think about what will happen to the Ukrainians. It will be worse. With China, let's not even start. And instead, you get this insane faction in the United States, which is basically saying, oh yeah, we have to cut our losses on Russia, But the reason why we want to cut our losses on Russia is so we can really get going on China, right? This is not going to work. So my big hope is, and you're right, if you look at GDP and purchasing power parity, if you look at the absolute size of the economy, if you look at manufacturing, I mean, Ben Norton did a really good show about this a month ago or so, right? It's really worth looking up. If you look at what China actually is, it's a much harder nut to crack than Russia.
Yes.
Much worse again. If you couldn't deal with Russia, you don't touch China. That would be elementary logic, right? Now, my big hope is one, which is to get this proxy war thing going in the way they did with Ukraine. You need a willing partner like Ukraine. I mean, that is Ukraine's horrible tragedy, that its own government went along with this. The Ukrainian government was not helpless. If in early 2022, the Ukraine, before this large-scale invasion, right? I know some people don't like the term, but we know what I mean. Before February 2022, right? If the Ukrainian government had turned around to the West and said, you know what? We don't want to be wrapped up in this proxy war that might be coming. We want to compromise with Russia. We're going to talk to Russia, right? The West couldn't have done a thing. The West could have punished them a little bit economically. They could have, pulled a long face. But actually, Ukraine was in a position in, say, January 2022 still, before the shit really hit the fan, of playing both sides. They were in an excellent position of balancing between these two huge powers, right? And avoiding the war and getting some sort of profit out of it. It would have been messy. It would have been difficult. Both sides would have kept sort of messing with Ukraine, right? For instance, if Ukraine hadn't seen a big war, you would certainly have seen a lot of intelligence activity from both sides, like meeting in the middle, and fighting under the carpet there. But that would have been much better than a huge war, right? Obviously, and Ukraine could have prospered economically in this situation. They didn't do this. They chose a side that was a really stupid idea. I'm very sorry, but it's true. Now, my big hope, to come back to the question of China and the USA, is that the Taiwanese have watched Ukraine. That the Taiwanese have watched Ukraine very carefully. And that there will be enough people in Taiwan, whatever shape that will take, who will rebel against being used the same way. And who will say, whatever happens, this is not what we do. We will not become a battlefield, right? If you, the United States, want to get going on China, you can do it somewhere else, but you're not going to do it on our island, and you're not going to do it pretending you're defending us. Now, Taiwan isn't there, unfortunately. The official policy of Taiwan is still going in the other direction. But I very much hope that in the population of Taiwan, people have looked very carefully what has happened to the Ukrainians. And it is a horrible example, and they should do everything they can to avoid a similar fate.
On that matter, as I was talking to Carl Zar, and he made it known that on the island that's about 2 kilometers from mainland China that is still under Taiwanese control, the U.S. Marines have been deployed to that island, which is roughly a mile away from mainland China. That is one of the highest provocations that could happen, because if China deployed Marines to Mexico, this would be an unacceptable national security threat for the United States, and yet the United States sees nothing wrong with deploying Marines 1 mile away from mainland China. This is what I'm saying. This is why all of this stuff has to collapse, because in the elite and those who are the power brokers in the West, they have this vision that I can, but you can't. The rules apply to thee, but not to me. And as long as they continue to do that, they will alienate not only their enemies, but their allies alike. Just to give you an example, when Turkey decided to live up to its sovereignty and make decisions that were in the best interest of its sovereignty, the United States, which is supposedly be an ally, waged economic war to try to bring down the lira so that they could overthrow the government and cause mass uprisings across Turkey. And I'm saying, do the U.S. and Western elites understand that their policies are what is turning allies to enemies?
Um, I don't think they do, because look, one problem that they have, to finally understand that they're antagonizing, right? The United States is antagonizing the whole world. Nobody can stand it anymore, right? And those who pretend they can stand it, they can't stand it either. They just don't say it, right? But the issue with this is that there is an important part of the world. It's declining. It's declining. It's full of problems, but it is still important, and it's also very arrogant, a little bit like America, that unfortunately is helping the elite in Washington to cling to their illusions, and that's Europe. And of course, what I mean here is like the Europe that's organized in overlappingly the European Union and NATO, right? It's not perfect overlap, but it's pretty strong. And that sort of NATO, EU, Europe historically has a task. It has a task. And the task of that Europe should have been, after the Cold War, and especially now, to emancipate itself from the United States. They could be friends, that's a different issue. But emancipate itself from the United States, say, look, we have our own interests, and we are not following you, and we are not helping you. And that in itself might, I'm not saying I can predict this, but it might have helped American elites to be a bit smarter about their own limits. But what we've seen from Europe, and I think this is a great responsibility, it's really a guilt in Europe's case. We have basically, I'm a European, I'm from Germany, we have egged the United States on by our behavior. Instead of telling them, no, this is wrong, you can't do this, you can't wage war in one country after another in the Middle East, you can't wage war in Ukraine, you have to negotiate with the Russians, it makes sense. Those are the positions we should have taken. We've always done the opposite, almost without fail. The only moment where there was a little tiny bit of European resistance was, again, the first Gulf War. But that's ages ago. And after that, Europe has marched in lockstep with the United States, in lockstep. And now that things are crashing down over Ukraine and over Gaza, Israel, Palestine, you have these very tiny signs like Borrell, Josep Borrell, who is de facto the foreign minister. He's got a different title, but he's the foreign minister of the EU, right? He's getting cold feet. He's getting cold feet. And now he's starting to say things like, oh, but you know what? The West doesn't really have Ukraine's best interests at heart. Oh, really? You've understood this by now. In 2021-22, he was among the worst warmongers, among the very worst. I remember this well. And he has been there throughout this war. And the only reason why he's changing his tune a tiny little bit, which has no consequences, is that it's going downhill. And even he can now see it. That's what's happening, but it's too late. Europe should have played a role of trying to talk sense into the American elite. And if trying to talk sense wouldn't have helped, Europe should have played a role of trying to at least delay them and break them down by saying, do what you want, but you're on your own. We are not helping you. And up until now, we see the opposite. Even now, the Germans, the British, the French, they're still on board with this whole anti-China policy, right after this Ukraine fiasco, where it's high time that, again, the Europeans should say, you know what? If you want to have a big war with China, first of all, we think it's an awful idea. Please don't do it. And secondly, you are on your own. Please don't count on us. We are doing the opposite. We are constantly telling them that they can count on us and that we are going to follow them. It's a huge European failure.
Mm-hmm. Before we go any more on the subject, John O'Grady Art says, Mr. Amar is a thoughtful and insightful guest. Thank you. I've recently come across your channel. I like how you give space and time for your guests to develop their thoughts. Keep up the great work. Thank you. And the reason I do that is because I hate watching interviews where the guest constantly gets interrupted, especially in mid-thought when they're getting ready to say something. I hate that it just boils my blood. They'll ask a question, the guests will get ready to talk on it, and then they'll just cut them off and go to something else, and I hate that. So I'm just trying to give a show that's a little bit different from everybody else's. Also, we have PB World says, wasn't Mr. Amar on the Duran a few days ago? Were you on the Duran a few days ago?
Yes, that's true. Same person. It's me.
All right. Speaking of the Duran, we'll have Professor Glenn Deason on the platform next week from the Duran. So check that out.
Say hello to me. From me, please. Say hello from me. Seriously.
Yeah. Southside Mike says, shout out to Long Island. We have PB World says UK lapdogs aren't complaining. Then he says, Mr. Amar, you are absolutely right. And then Southside Mike says, the destruction of Nord Stream stands as an example of European subservience to American hegemony, as well as the subsequent deindustrialization. You take that. I mean, I'm glad you brought that. That is.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Absolutely. It's like they tested it, right? They tested how far they could go. And it worked. It worked, you know. The Germans still basically said, thank you very much. Can we have some more? I mean, it's insane.
It amazes me as we talk on this deindustrialization. How is it that the United States, within minutes of the terrorist bombing in Russia, can tell you who bombed it and how it had no connections with Ukraine, but yet they can't tell you who bombed and blew up Nord Stream? How is that even possible?
It's not. It makes no sense. We both know it. It makes no sense.
Okay. Southside Mike also says, in regards to China, there is a deep-seated, virulent history of anti-Chinese racial discrimination at the cultural as well as governmental level. Don't underestimate the reality of yellow peril. Why we're going to transition to the Middle East shortly, but why do you believe that the Western leaders continue to run into this wall of arrogance, and they continue to try to push through the wall of arrogance? They're losing on all fronts, and they're doubling and tripling and quadrupling down on failed policies instead of pausing for a second, taking a step back and surveying the situation as it is, not as they think, but as it really is on the ground, and then adjusting their policies for the reality. Why won't they do that?
Yeah, I don't have one answer for that. The one thing I would say first is that, historically speaking, this has happened again and again, right? When you look at states and empires even that have fallen either due to some form of internal collapse, revolution, civil war, mix of it, or to war with others, right? Or all of it, right? Very often you see that you look back and you feel like from a certain point on, the people who ran these states should have understood that they needed to do something very different from what they kept doing, right? And it wasn't rational to go on. So you have this idea that they may be very different from you, they may have different ideologies, but why aren't they at least rational in their self-interest, right? How do we preserve what we have, right? And not very often, but again and again, that actually isn't happening. And I think one of your commentators here had a good point, which is sometimes it's a question of racism. I think it is sometimes a question of ultimately racist arrogance. And frankly, I think, if you ask somebody in Brussels, in Berlin, if they have an iota of racism in the way they think, they would be aghast. They would be shocked. No, absolutely not, right? But what they don't realize is that even with their best intentions in the area, and they don't always have them, they have transformed their racism. They transform it into a sort of culturalism, right? Where somebody, for instance, like Annalena Baerbock, to make this a bit more concrete, foreign minister of Germany. Germany is in many ways really not doing well. It's not doing well industrially. The trains are really not running on time, seriously. It's not doing well militarily. It's not doing well in terms of the mood in the country. The mood in Germany is not good and hasn't been good for a long time. It's not doing well in innovation. It's definitely behind in top-notch technology. All of these areas, Germany has really big problems. That doesn't mean they can't be resolved. I don't know. Maybe they will be, maybe not. But it's a problem-ridden country. So its foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, goes to China and basically takes this attitude, you can really see it, of coming there to tell them how to behave. And it's so absurd. It's getting like insane. There is this famous picture of her and Wang Yi standing next to each other, and Wang Yi looks just amazed. And everybody has always wondered why. Probably because he cannot figure out what this person is thinking she's doing. He's like he's part of this elite that is running this colossus of innovation that has had enormous successes, right? That is ahead of Germany in many areas technologically. It's among others the Chinese electric vehicle industry that will crush the traditional German car industry. That's already happening now, right? And there's this German, and she's trying to tell him what to do, and she's trying to lecture him on how politics should look and how the regime should operate. And I can understand that they don't even understand anymore who they're talking to and why we are so strange. And I think the explanation why a lot of Europeans, and I guess Americans too, are still so irrationally arrogant is that there is a racism in play here. Sometimes it might be really racism, like the old-fashioned thing, but sometimes it might be this transformed racism, where it attaches itself not to skin color, skin pigmentation, the way people look. It attaches itself, for instance, to this deep-seated prejudice that in terms of political organization, we always know better. We always know better. And if these guys are showing us that their stuff is working, we don't care. We still know better, right?
Thinking about the arrogance of these leaders in the Western world, it is almost like this. They will impose sanctions on a certain entity or a certain nation because they have a gripe with that nation or that leader or that certain entity. And then they will go and say, you have to abide by our sanctions, as if you are a part of their nation or that you are governed by German or UK or US law. This is, to me, this is the height of arrogance. And this is one of the main things that is causing the de-dollarization of the entire world. Because if you have a beef with me, how can you impose your anger with me on other people that may trade with me, that may benefit from me?
No, I totally agree with you. I mean, look, the word that comes to my mind is what we are claiming, the United States and the West, right? And I recently saw an interview with Kishore Mahbubani, right? And he made the important point that, you can tweak the figures a little. But he said, look, if you think in terms of population, the West is 12% of global population. So maybe you count a little different and you get 15, but right, that's the order of magnitude. And the rest of the world is everybody else, right? And so this West, or rather its political elites, to be fair, and its cultural elites, its media elites, what is happening is that what we are claiming, in one word, privilege. We are claiming privilege, that for us things are different. For instance, and this is, I think, what we're talking about here, we claim the right to invent a whole second world of rules, right? Here's the paradox. We live in a world with international law globally developed to an extent as never before in human history. International law as a body of thought, as even in institutions, it has never existed in the way it exists now, the real international law, right? What does the West do? Instead of saying, well, this is great, we have this wonderful international law, let's develop that, let's work with that, the West says, oh no, actually we have rules. the rules-based order, right? And everybody who's not an idiot has understood this a long time ago, and the Russians have understood it, and the Chinese have understood it. Everybody understands this. The rules-based order is the opposite of international law.
Mm-hmm.
It's there so that the West can appeal to something else when it doesn't like international law. And where have we seen this most recently? As you know, we have finally had a resolution in the United Nations Security Council passing that demands, that's the term, a ceasefire in Gaza, right? Finally. Why did it pass? Because the United States for once didn't veto it. They still couldn't vote for it like every decent state would do, everybody else does, but they didn't veto it. Wow, great achievement, baby steps, right? But here comes the next thing. Every international law expert agrees that when the United Security Council passes a resolution, it is in essence international law. These resolutions have the rank of international law. And that is actually written down in Article 25 of the UN Charter, which everybody who's in the UN has signed up to, right? So it's part of the rule book. So here's the thing. Next step, the United States comes out and says, oh, this is an unbinding resolution. It's non-binding, right? And as a lot of people have pointed out, this is really absurd. This is not, this isn't a matter of opinion. This is insane. This is like saying, I've visited the atheist Pope, right? Or, I found some snow that's burning. It's nonsense. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't exist. Especially when the United Security Council uses the term demand, it is absolutely clear. That means a binding instruction, it's really an order to the state affected to obey. That's what this is. It's the quality of law. It has to be obeyed. That's the nature of a law. And the United States sits aside and says, oh no, this one is non-binding. That's insane. There's absolutely no basis for this. Imagine, I'm sorry, I have to tell you this, but imagine you have a mafia boss, right? And you pull him into court and you finally sentence the guy to, 50 years, right? And he gets up from his seat and he says, you know what? I think that's non-binding. It's idiotic. It's idiotic. But this is where we are. So we have the United States leading the West. All these guys do similar things. This one they didn't quite follow because it was so extreme, right? Even the United Kingdom was like, oh no, not quite this far, right? But the principle is they're putting themselves up outside and above international law. So the position that Washington puts itself into, to be serious, is to say about international law, we use it when we like to, and we don't like it. It doesn't appeal to us or to our friends. In this case, to Israel. It just doesn't appeal. We've decided it doesn't apply. That's it. Over. This is completely absurd. This is rogue state behavior. And in the case of the United States, it's rogue empire. That's what this really is, right?
Well, that is on display everywhere, because as she talks about maintaining the territorial integrity of Ukraine, she discards the territorial integrity of Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, as the Iraqi parliament has voted multiple times for her to leave, as the legitimate Syrian government has demanded multiple times that America leaves. And why is it that the news in the West refuse to report this in the way that it should be reported, without the spin, and they are silent to the atrocities and the flagrant violations of international law that the U.S. and her allies commit? But if someone else does something just close to what they've done, this is an outrage and they must be punished for it.
I think that the underlying reason, if that's the question, is that I know this sounds very simplistic, but I really think ultimately the reason is that for a very long time they used to get away with it. So the United States is is an extremely powerful country, although it's declining. I'm convinced of that, but it still has a lot of power. And its elite got used to something that it actually shares with the Israeli elite, namely that mostly it would never be punished for the most outrageous offenses against both, even domestic law, quite often, I think, but especially international law. So to an extent, the United States, what's so strange about it and what confuses people so much, it's that it's a country that has projected a very, very strong narrative about being value-driven, being value-oriented, wanting to adhere by rules. But in reality, the United States is, I think, the crudest case of might makes right in recent history, since World War II. Since World War II. It doesn't have a monopoly on this, right? States do this. And when they accumulate power, unfortunately, more or less all of them tend to do it to some extent, right? But the United States is an extreme case. And that brings me to something else, which is, one way I think one can read our current moment in the world, right, globally speaking, is that I think it's clear that this cannot continue. Of course, it should not continue for many moral reasons, right? But that's obvious, and that was true a long time ago. But what I mean now is the United States is declining, and it will simply no longer have the power to behave like this, right? It will stop. And when that happens, there's one very big question, which is, are its elites going to fight for this? Are they going to try to resist what I would say is the trend of history with violence, ever more violence? Or is there some point at which they will finally at least accept that their position has changed and that they must find a new modus vivendi with the others on the planet, right? And it's something the Chinese have been signaling to them. I mean, the Chinese, sometimes when I observe how the Chinese communicate, the Chinese leaders communicate with American leaders, I think I'm looking at psychotherapy or something. It's like they're basically trying to talk them down. Not always, but sometimes it's like, look, can you please calm down? In the new world, there will be a place for you. You don't have to be so afraid. Don't be so violent. Even in the multipolar world, it can be really nice, even for you. You're still going to be a great power. You're just not going to be alone as you like to be. That's all that's going to change. This is sometimes what the Chinese seem to be saying to them. And what is so strange to me, and I've said this before somewhere, so I'm repeating myself a little bit, but what's so really strange to me is that the American elites cannot even come to the point where they say, yes, we want to pursue American interests. We are egotists about our national interests. Okay, fine. But we understand that we need a new deal with the world. Precisely to preserve our interests, we must find a new balance with the others, right? Instead, it seems they're really hell-bent on fighting for it. And if I may add one thing, this is a very strange comparison. There is an excellent book by a fairly conservative American historian who also used to supervise my dissertation a long time ago, Steve Kotkin. And he wrote a book that's called Armageddon Averted. And it's a short book. And the basic question in the book is brilliant. The question is, the Soviet Union was so strong and they were so convinced of being right and that they had a future. Why did they not fight? Why did they actually give up fairly peacefully, right? And what then happened to them was pretty bad, so you can think about that. But the fact is, in the 1980s, between 85 and 87, 89, it's very concrete. In these 3 to 4 years or 5 years, the Soviet Union fundamentally makes a huge decision for an empire. It says, we are giving up the fight for the sort of primacy together with the United States or even against them. We're giving up. We're negotiating a surrender, right? It was a negotiated end to the Cold War. And it comes about because the Soviet leadership, now note this, those evil communists were smart and humane enough at this point to not be obstinate and say, you know what, this Cold War, this is too dangerous. We are declining. We need to find a new place in the world. And then things went terribly wrong for them, and Putin is still bitter about it. That's a different story. But the United States, their elite seems to be not like that. Their elite seems to be saying, we will fight to the last moment. And if we take the world with us, we'll do it. Either we will dominate the world or there will not be a world. That seems to be the current American elite attitude. And it's very frightening.
And believe it or not, you described it perfectly. That is exactly the mind state of not just those in power, but the schools that they come through. As I often tell on my show, I say, I think Mr. Putin, I don't think he grasps the depths of arrogance of the Western leaders. I think he wants to genuinely be friends with the West and wants everybody to prosper. He does not understand that there's an air of that permeates across the Western political scene, where America believes that divinely that she must control everything. And if she can't control everything, then I won't leave the world in a position for anybody to rule. And to bear witness to that, look at her provocations globally, everywhere. And then think about the lunacy of this policy. You have China. China is her largest investor, her largest trade partner, holds the largest amount of her debt, and yet she is provoking China and making war with her because she believes that this is the last effort. Her war scientists did a study saying that we have to do this by 2025 or there will be absolutely no possibility for us to win. And so that is something in her mind, and she's built up her military for that day, that if I can't rule, I'm killing everybody. I'm not leaving anybody in a position to dominate. And I think that permeates throughout the levels of government, that I'm exceptional and I cannot accept being on a level with you. I can't accept being on a level with equal peers or near peer power. As a matter of fact, Tarik, in one of the stated policies of the United States, it is to not allow any nation to rise and challenge the United States, or any combination of nations to rise and catch up with the United States. So that in itself shows us that in their minds, that they must rule at all costs. And that means even if it means taking the world to war.
And unfortunately, there are two things that I would add. One is, unfortunately, there is a paranoid side to this, right? One is arrogance, where it's like as you said, it almost feels like we have a divine right. We have to dominate the planet, right? The exceptional nation, the indispensable nation, all this nonsense. I'm sorry, but that's what it is, right? That's arrogance. But there is a paranoid dimension, which is very dangerous as well, which is that I think for quite a few people in Washington, the idea of being safe, of the country being safe in the world, as safe as countries get, right, has now been associated with this dominance. They are not having another model anymore. Whereas every other state in the world has to have a model, an idea of its own safety that says, no, I can't dominate everybody. That's not the way to be safe, right? The way to be safe is I have allies, I have to keep my opponents in check, I have to watch the scene, so to speak. That's safety. But there's only one state in the world, literally only one, that says my way of safety is dominate everyone else, which is an extreme idea. So once your mind gets narrowed down to that, once you get tunnel vision on that, you become completely paranoid if you decline. Because your decline means you will not be able to practice that anymore, since you have forgotten, but everybody else knows that there are other ways of being relatively safe. You will feel, well, I'm totally unsafe now, right? And again, that will also make you fight. The other thing I would add is that I think you're right about Putin concerning an earlier version, but I am worried. In fact, I think that has changed. I think especially after this war, Putin is still ready to work with the West. He will be pragmatically, but he won't be friends. I think that's over. That was 2000 to maybe 2008, right? And then there was an intermediary phase, I would say, where it's not clear. And then I think after 2014, things really started slipping. And then after 2022, that door is closed. So once this war with Russia, against Russia, over Ukraine is over, and I think it will end with some sort of Russian victory, the Russians are not going to be our friends anymore. They will be extremely cautious with us. The Europeans will have a very hard time because they're much closer to them than the United States and much weaker, right? That's what you get. And the Russians will be pragmatic. They'll deal. They'll rebuild trade, I think, but they won't be friends. I think that's over. That will take a long time before we get to friendship again.
Well, what do you think about the landscape? And I know time is of the essence, but just a couple more questions. What do you think about the geopolitical landscape as Russia brings this war in Ukraine to a head and does what it does in Ukraine, weakens the European Union through this and weakens the United States, and China challenges the United States, and then we see that the United States is constantly deficit spending. So when these debts come home to roost in the United States, this will be a threefold position, because Europe will suffer, the United States will suffer, and because Israel receives a lot of money from the United States and Europe to keep afloat, wouldn't they tank also?
I hope so. Look, concerning Israel, absolutely, to get that out of the way first, I think that Israel has always been an extremely oppressive, in many ways criminal regime. There's no question, if you look at the facts and not at the ideology. But especially after what they've done now in Gaza since October, I don't see a future for this state. And I want to be very clear here, right? This gets misinterpreted as if you were after every single Israeli or anything. Not at all. Not at all. My idea for the future is Palestine, free, sovereign, equal, and making an offer to all former Israelis to stay if they're ready to obey the law and live as equals without the former apartheid privileges. That's and I think it's a very humane idea. That's my idea for the future. Concerning those people who have taken part in crimes directly, I think they should all face courts in the future. And look, it's utopian maybe, but my hope is it won't even be international courts, but Palestinian courts, actually. I believe that the way to such a situation where the Palestinians will be freed probably lies through major regional war, unfortunately, against Israel. And that war can happen when Israel will lose American support or when America will be weakened, right? And once again, I want to stress, none of this says horrible things should happen to all Israelis. Absolutely not, the opposite. But this type of terror regime that is really based on ethnic cleansing and genocide, that can't go on. That there has to be an end to this. So that's about Israel. But the other thing is that the geopolitical effects of the fallout from what will happen in Ukraine, I think that the European Union and NATO will be weakened very, very much. It will be a paradox because NATO has expanded, and they're very proud of this, that they have 32 members now, I think, and they took in Sweden, they took in Finland. I think Sweden and Finland made horrific mistakes by doing this, and they will come to regret it. But NATO as a whole will be weakened, the EU will be weakened, and in 10 years' time, 5 years' time, we might be looking at a Europe that paradoxically will have become dependent on Russia, exactly what they were trying to avoid. That is possible, especially because the electoral politics in Europe are also highly unstable, right? So there might be major changes in the types of governments and coalitions and parties that rule various important and not so important European countries. That's also in the mix, right? So there's a lot of change coming, I think. For the United States, there's always the option of some form of isolationism, as it's called. I wouldn't call it that. I would call it maybe taking a more normal position in the world, right? It could also retreat. It could be forced to retreat, which would probably be healthy. Here's what could go wrong. The United States as a whole, this is the most dangerous player in the game. They could choose to fight at some point. But there also is, of course, smaller players like, say, France, who could do something insane, for instance, in Ukraine, by landing a brigade of troops there while Ukraine is already losing, right? Macron has basically threatened to do this. I don't think he will do it. But what I'm trying to say is this whole trajectory is not only very pessimistic from a European point of view. The other thing is also extremely volatile. There are a lot of things that could go wrong. If, for instance, somebody is insane enough in Europe and lets the F-16 fighters that are going to be delivered now to Ukraine, most likely, right? If they let them start from airfields outside Ukraine, say in Poland, the Russians have made it very clear what they will do. They will attack the airfields. At that moment, we would be in a situation where the clash between NATO and the Russians has become direct, right? That's Russia firing missiles at a NATO member. From that moment on, it's very hard to predict what will happen. I would hope that people will still try to contain that crisis and somehow not let it get to World War III. But then we are 5 minutes past midnight once this happens, and we are disturbingly close to these possibilities, right? In a very, very general sense, look, I know how strange this sounds because we are used to hearing about the Russians and formerly Soviet Union. But I really honestly think that for a few decades, maybe, the main task in global politics will be for the international community, the real one, not the West, the real international community, to contain the United States. I'm not kidding, and I'm not saying this out of anger or spite, but the United States is now a very volatile and dangerous player. And it may be very important that big powers like China and Russia, and in the future others, come together and tell the United States, if you try to set the world ablaze, we are all going to gang up on you and you will lose. That's called containment and deterrence, right? To basically box a dangerous state in. And I think this is something that needs to happen to the United States until its elite has recovered from the insanity it's undergoing now.
Brinko R, thank you for the $5 super chat. Do you believe that the reason that the United States, Great Britain, and the EU continued these wars, and whether they be economic, whether they be covert wars for resources, or just open wars like they're doing in Ukraine, do you believe that they are pushing these things because they are afraid of the new paradigm that is taking shape, where they are not the Lord and Master of everything, and that other people will come to the table, and their opinion will matter just as much as as the West? Do you believe that this is one of the main reasons why they are all in on the sanctions regime and the waging of wars?
Yes, I think that in essence you're right. I think that we are dealing with highly unimaginative political elites that cannot solve the task of reimagining the role of their countries and their whole societies and their peoples in a new, more equal, multipolar world. I mean, this is, in a way, you could describe it like that, right? It's not just the United States. We have gone for a few hundred years. You can count different ways, but it's a few hundred years, right? Anywhere you count. We've gone through a very strange historical moment just in human history, where the West has somehow managed to dominate, pillage, abuse, make dependent most others. Right? This is really the history of the few last 100 years. And the problem, I think, is that the West has to fully shed all the habits that it has got into mentally as a result of this way of living. And that is a process as well. You could argue that this process started there's always been resistance, obviously, against these Western brutalities, right, and this domination. But in a way, you could argue that the West really had to take cognizance and accept that it had to make concessions. Well, I would guess since, say, Indian independence. Maybe that was the first big one, 1947. And then you have post-war decolonization, right? This huge wave, of course, right, that follows then after that. So in a way, this is an ongoing process. But what the West did with this first wave of having to accept that it couldn't just rule the world anymore, right? It basically cheated, right? It basically sort of retreated a little bit and said, okay, we are not going to rule you openly anymore, but we will find all sorts of other ways to dominate you, economically, militarily, if we have to. Then we'll invent reasons and we'll invade you. Or we set up courts, for instance, international courts, International Criminal Court, for instance, that for some reasons always go after you, but never after us. Right? There are all these different ways in which the West has cheated. I mean, listen, it's very simple. That is simple stuff. It's observable. And I think what we are going towards is a world in which this layer of cheating, this buffer, is going to dissolve. And so now the West will really have to come clean, and they will really have to readjust in a way that they haven't had to readjust for about 500 years. Right? So you know how at the beginning of the show we talked about how Russia is very weak in the 90s and everybody in Washington thinks this is normal, right? And therefore they get it all wrong. Normality is different in the Russian case. The West has been in an anomalous position for about 500, 400 years. Historically anomalous, right? The Old West, let's say the pre-Columbus West, the medieval West, was not dominating the world. It was afraid of everybody because it was weak, right? No, it's true, right? The West doesn't have to be afraid again, but it has to be balanced. The West finally also has to learn that somehow you got to live with the others on this planet without dominating them, either openly or on the sly. It's all gone. That's true.
So in closing, because I mean you've given us over an hour of your time, and I know how busy you are, and maybe we can have you back on the platform again in the near future because you kick butt. I mean, I could talk to you all day about this stuff. But do you see from 2024 to 2027? Do you see if these policies of the West continue? Do you see the decline and fall of America and the collapse of the Western-based so-called international rule-based order?
I think the weakening is definitely already there. You mentioned de-dollarization. The BRICS is really building alternative currency systems now, partly through electronic systems, crypto, all very complicated stuff that I don't fully understand, but they're definitely busy with it, and they're talking about, and I think this is serious talk. Militarily, I think they will be weakened after this proxy war defeat that will come in Ukraine. Collapse, who knows? You know, I don't want America to collapse. You know, actually, you know, to get a little personal, my wife is American. My daughter is American through my wife. I have lived in America for 8 years, and I've not, or even more if I pull it all together. I have nothing against that. In fact, I like it. The way I like Russia, you know, both big countries, a lot of energy. It's actually fascinating cultures. But the problem is the volatility of the politics of America and what they can do to the rest of humanity. That is a very serious problem. So you look, my wish for America would be a massive domestic change, which I think would benefit the vast majority of Americans who I don't think want this anymore either, right? The dark side of domestic change, if everything goes terribly wrong, is civil war, right? This is when you wait too long with the change and then things get violent. And I can't predict, but I find it interesting that in American culture, I do think we see an uptick in thinking about civil war. Right? We had DMZ, the graphic novel, DMZ, the Netflix show. Now we have a movie about civil war. It's clearly there. People are worried about this. And I think they're intuitively right. They're intuitively right. There is a real danger that America itself might implode in a very violent way, which I would obviously absolutely hate to see. You know, there are very naive people out there, and I understand them because America outside itself can be so violent and unjust. So sometimes you might find people in Europe, for example, on the left who say, well, yeah, let them go after each other. No, first of all, it's inhumane. A lot of Americans don't deserve anything like that. Like most people don't deserve anything like that. But the other thing is, frankly, if America implodes in some violent form, I think everything is going to get worse, frankly. It's not just going to retract into itself, it might also take its own violence outside itself. So, you know, my desperate hope is that somehow the United States will finally learn to change itself again. I've almost lost that hope. I know how strange that sounds, but if that doesn't happen, yeah, it could be a very dark future for all of us. I think that's possible.
For those of you who are listening, please hit the like button and then think about subscribing. Tarik, shukram for joining us today
Thank
on
you. Thank
the
you.
most powerful platform for truth. We got to have you back on soon because I have a lot to ask you.
Thank you. That's very
Hey,
kind.
and in the meantime, be blessed. I'll send you this link to this video shortly so that you can have it for your own personal use or whatever like that if you want to post it or whatever
Of
like
course.
that.
Of course.
Thank you so much and may you be blessed
Thank
and
you.
be
Thank you, Rashid. Thank
all
you.
right. Everybody, we've had a powerful show. I want to ask each and every one of you to join us on the channel member stream tomorrow. We're going to try to stream for the channel members. I'm constantly trying to bring you a lot of guests. I know you're looking in the back and you're saying, hey, his green screen is not up right. That is up like that purposely. We're doing renovations in the back, and the part that is being renovated, we have it hidden. So it's like that. So just ignore that. Listen, I want to thank each and every one of you for giving me another hour of your day and another day of your time. From the bottom of my heart to the depth of my soul, I just want to tell you that I appreciate the support. Continue to support us. Let's beat the algorithm. Let us continue to go forth in truth and give everything we have in the cause of truth. On that note, I go out with love in my heart for each and every one of you who loves truth, but know that the love that I have for you will always pale in comparison to the love that my God has for you. Until we next speak again, stay strong, stay true, but above all things, stay righteous. Hey, mama, your baby boy loves you more than life. Deuces, everybody. All right.